Good evening. This is an interview with Max Blumenthal, the journalist, and we're here to talk with Max about the case of Julian Assange. Julian, as you know, is being held in Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in the UK and is currently in the second phase of his extradition trial, which is running at the Old Bailey. My name is Deepa Govindarajan Driver. I'm an academic and trade unionist. I am running this call in a personal capacity, not speaking on behalf of my employer or on behalf of the Holiday Inn Society, but I will offer some thoughts from being at the trial some of the days, and also invite Max to tell us a little bit about some of the issues related to the rule of law, in particular, the right to a fair trial, a right that is absolute, a right that is absolutely fundamental, and in particular relation to the right to a fair trial, the right to legal privilege, that is the privacy of conversations with lawyers, which has been violated egregiously in Julian's case as a result of the recording of Julian's privileged conversations and the breach of his privacy and the privacy of journalists, medical professionals, and other political and other guests who were visiting Julian at the embassy, at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Thanks very much, Max, for sparing the time. I'd like to start by asking you to set the scene a little bit, to tell us about how you came to be involved with looking at what was going on, what is currently being adjudicated in Spain as part of a trial investigating UC Global. And if you could, for our viewers, tell us a little bit about what UC Global is, what it does, and what you're investigating in respect to the case. Over to you, Max.
Well, thanks for having me, Deepa. I, in our last webinar, talked a lot about UC Global and laid out what I think this kind of spying saga that really merits would deserve a Hollywood blockbuster treatment if Hollywood hadn't been completely co-opted by the Pentagon and intelligence agencies. UC Global is sort of unknown to most Americans, although it is at the heart of one of the biggest scandals in the assault on a free press, assault on attorney-client privilege, and the US government's attack on the leading dissident in the West, Julian Assange. And it's UC Global is not well known to most Americans for a very good reason, or not a good reason, it's actually a bad reason, which is the choice by the US media, US mainstream media, to ignore this shocking scandal. I wrote a piece at thegrayzone.com, where I'm the editor, published it about a week ago, about how mainstream reporters from the Washington Post, people who are veterans of the New York Times, PBS, were spied on themselves by UC Global, that UC Global spies attempted to steal their personal, and they said nothing. They have said nothing. And so that tells you why it's so important for me, as someone who's part of what you could call the alternative press, the independent media, to tell this story, because it is the story of what appears to be a CIA contractor running a campaign of black operations against Julian Assange and everyone associated with him in order to destroy him and WikiLeaks because of the threat it presented to the US government's ability to control the narrative and to avoid accountability for the crimes it was committing around the globe. So to make a really long story short, UC Global was hired by the Trump administration, it appears, specifically through Mike Pompeo's CIA, which labeled WikiLeaks a hostile, non-state intelligence operation, to spy on Julian Assange and all visitors when he was trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. It appears that the contract began immediately after the Trump administration entered office, and the contract was authored by the corporation that recruited the CEO of UC Global, David Morales. That corporation is Las Vegas Sands, which belongs to probably the largest individual donor to Donald Trump and the Republican Party, Sheldon Adelson, the ultra-Zionist casino tycoon. And it's very well established that Sheldon Adelson took care of this contract through his security team, his vice president for executive protection, Zohar Lahav, an Israeli American, personally recruited David Morales at a security fair. And they wanted him because he was already security service to protect the embassy. And it was just out of convenience. It was a Spanish company. He was already protecting the president of Ecuador's children. Ecuador's own security service couldn't get to the embassy in London because of visa issues. So they just hired someone who was already within the Schengen zone. And so this guy Morales has under his control the most important embassy guest in the world. So naturally, and someone who the US government wanted to destroy, naturally the US government would target him. They did so through a Trump operation. And so throughout 2017, Julian Assange was spied on. We all know that. We've all seen the footage. Some of the people watching this were themselves spied on because they might have been friends of Julian. Pamela Anderson was spied on when she visited him. Randy Credico was filmed hanging out with Julian in the kitchen. Stella Morris, who was Julian's partner, was not only filmed there constantly, she was targeted. She was followed. UC Global spies posing as embassy guards would try to steal her infant son's diaper out of the trash to try to obtain its DNA and then track that to Julian in order to prove it was his child. This was an obsession. And various plots were hatched throughout the year of 2017 that began to frighten and disturb other members of the UC Global team, a business partner, employees who actually worked at the embassy. They started to hear Morales plot the assassination of Julian Assange, proposing poisoning him. They heard about plots to kidnap Julian Assange by leaving a door open at the embassy. And they went to the Spanish police. They said, this is absurd. There was fraud, bribery. I mean, an embassy employee was being paid not to talk about UC Global's activities. And I think most crucially, the violation of attorney-client privilege, where Julian Assange's meetings with his legal team were being spied on through
And I think that's really interesting because there is virtually nothing they have left sacred in the sense they've even gone after a little baby. So it is quite appalling and despicable, and it's particularly timely that we hear about this from you at a time when Julian is in court, going through a very difficult time. As you know, in the past week, we've had the various psychiatrists, both from the defense and from the prosecution, opine about Julian's mental state. And you will remember back from this time when Julian was in the embassy that when he was concerned about being spied upon, there were a number of journalists who came out saying, oh, you're paranoid and we don't actually believe you, and you have an overinflated sense of yourself. And this kind of disregard for what he clearly understood right at the start was an effort to dislodge him from the embassy and spy on him in order to entrap him is something that it's worth discussing more about. I'd also like to take a step back to the point you made earlier on in the conversation about a number of esteemed, well-regarded journalists in the mainstream media being spied upon, because I know ARD and others in Germany have taken action as part of the Spanish case. So this is something that is well established. It's not something that these journalists don't know about. And it's very interesting, as you point out, that none of these other journalists have sought to protect their journalistic integrity, because presumably they hold data from sources, data from various meetings they've been at, and would like to protect these entities and have still not reported any of the issues. And I'm really interested to hear you say that. Could you tell us a little bit about how they started to come to light? You talked about the Spanish police being made aware by UC Global employees. When did that happen, and how did the case come about? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Right. So after the UC Global employees and a former business partner went to the Spanish police enacted an operation called Operación Tabanco, named after a kind of wine from Jerez de la Frontera. Jerez is a city in southern Spain where UC Global's offices are based. And the Spanish police love making up operation names like that, named after wines and foods. And so they were tracking David Morales, the CEO of UC Global. They were apparently tapping his phones. They were collecting testimony, as far as I know, from UC Global employees. And when Morales returned from a trip, which is itself the subject of my investigation, he was arrested in Spain in September 2019. So pretty much 2 years after, I would say just a little less than 2 years after his contract ended to spy on Assange. But he was pretty clearly maintaining a business relationship with Sheldon Adelson's Las Vegas Sands and was protecting Adelson and his family on the Queen Mary luxury yacht, which is the most expensive yacht in the world, owned by Sheldon Adelson when he was sailing around the Mediterranean. So he was arrested in September. The next month, a judge in the Spanish National Court charges Morales with embezzlement, fraud, violation of attorney-client privilege, violation of Assange's privacy, and illegal handgun possession, because 2 guns were found on his property with the serial numbers filed off. That's kind of what you want it. That's like what a hitman does. It's very disturbing. There were stacks of cash in there and guns with the serial numbers filed off. And who knows what he was planning. So that takes place in Spain's national court. It's the same court, actually, that oversaw the arrest of Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean military junta leader, in 1998. So this is a significant legal body that applies universal jurisdiction and gained access to hundreds and hundreds of text messages between Morales and his employees, Telegram chats, emails, and the IP addresses of emails, which showed that Morales was traveling to and from the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas, owned by Sheldon Adelson, and that he was also repeatedly staying in Northern Virginia near the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and specifically the CIA headquarters, and at a hotel just 2 blocks from the White House. So his trips putting him in the immediate proximity of a top Trump donor, the White House, and the U.S. intelligence apparatus. And you have all these testimonies from UC Global employees talking about how Morales was indeed working for U.S. intelligence, how he boasted after he was recruited at Las Vegas Sands by the VP of Executive Protection for Adelson, Zohar Lahav, that he boasted that he was working for the dark side, that he constantly referred to the American friends. In a previous report, I published a text message in which he said that we are working for the Agency of the Stars and Stripes. I mean, pretty clear reference to the CIA.
Yeah.
And what needed to be developed out of all of this information was the connection between Las Vegas Sands and the CIA. So in my first report, I introduced a figure who had previously been mostly unknown to the public, despite his very high standing in the world of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence, who is currently the Director of Global Security for Adelson's Las Vegas Sands, and that's Brian Nagel. Brian Nagel worked, I would say, above Zohar Lahav, and helped design pretty much the technology for US federal law enforcement and US intelligence early on in the early days of the internet to fight cybercrime. And what he did, according to reports that are sort of like open source reports, is that he would turn the tables on hackers and cyber criminals by using their same methods as well as confidential informants. So here was someone who's very well experienced in electronic surveillance at Las Vegas Sands, in Las Vegas, and David Morales is visiting there and receiving instructions in perfect English. This is someone who speaks Spanish. His English is horrible, and he's delivering it to his employees, and those instructions are telling them how to construct or establish a second server on the surveillance cameras at the Ecuadorian embassy so that Ecuador's security services don't see, so that the footage is fed back to the US without the Ecuadorian security services knowing. So I think it's very, just to like drill it down, I think like what I've been able to do so far is establish that Sheldon Adelson, this billionaire donor to Trump, was acting as a liaison through his operation between Mike Pompeo's CIA and this Spanish security contractor. And the defense, which David Morales is deploying in Spanish court, and I've interviewed his lawyer, Fernando Garcia, is that no, there was no such contract or involvement with the CIA at all. Everything was done with the Ecuadorians, and they knew all about it. And what they were merely doing, what Morales was doing, was protecting Julian Assange from the British police, which is just complete hogwash. It's ridiculous. But that's their defense, and I think, you know, these reports have, I think, destroyed that defense.
Could we take a little step back? You talked about these two layers of information. One that Morales was passing on to the Senain in his pretense of looking after the so-called guest at the embassy, and another layer which was created by Brian Nagel and his team which was transmitting information back out. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? How does something like that work? What was what would the Ecuadorian security services have thought? And I heard in a previous interview of yours, you talked about how Ecuador's own security agencies had been spied upon, through this. So could you tell us a little bit about that before we go into the actual case?
Yeah, great question. I think that this initial attempt to establish a separate server for the so-called American friends, or what Morales would call the American client, was initially unsuccessful. But he told his employees explicitly that he feared that Ecuador's Senain, the Ecuadorian security services, were onto us. He said, Senain is onto us, so they must not know. That establishes really clearly that he was working at cross purposes, or he was essentially violating his contract that he had with Ecuador's Senain to protect Julian Assange by working for the US. He was a double agent. And that's the most explosive charge that I think I've been able to establish very clearly. And that's why he tried to establish a second server. Ultimately, in December 2017, Julian Assange and his legal team began to develop a strategy for him to leave the embassy legally by gaining diplomatic status from a third-party country that was friendly with Ecuador. It looked like this plan was going to be fulfilled. And what was necessary was Ecuador's Senain to cooperate, to walk out of the embassy and get into a car. And so Romy Vallejo, who is then the head of Senain, comes to the embassy, visits Julian Assange, and I think this German public broadcaster has shown that footage that was recorded by UC Global of the head of Ecuador Security Services being spied on by a company that was supposedly working for him, but was actually being run by a double agent contracted by the CIA. And so, I mean, that meeting was broken up because the American friends were able to listen in. What I reported in my investigation from May of this year, which is called The American Friends, was that Todd Chapman, who was the US ambassador to Ecuador, began running around in the halls of power in Quito, threatening Ecuadorian officials, especially at the foreign ministry, and said, if you go forward with this plan, we're going to go crazy on you. And they said, like, how the hell did the US know? How did they know? And so it was pretty clear that they had been listening in on the meeting. So that plan was never followed through upon. And there were even more disturbing incidents that were described to me by a participant in those meetings with Julian Assange, the strategy meetings in December 2017. I was told that an Ecuadorian diplomat, upon returning to Ecuador after leaving the airport in an official government car, was robbed at gunpoint by two men on a motorcycle, and all they took and all they demanded was his laptop. So I think that with the CIA links, or the CIA hand being very clear here, it's obvious that the United States government, with the information it obtained from UC Global, took this well beyond the embassy in order to prevent Julian Assange from being able to legally leave and ensure that on April 11th, 2019, he would be kidnapped, taken prisoner by British police, and put in Belmarsh prison.
Yes, and it's quite disturbing to see Julian in court at the moment, and you can see that here is this person who is quite frail in a dock, which is at the back of the room. He's having to kneel on the floor of the dock to speak through a tiny gash in the window between panes of glass to make himself heard to the person in the fourth or fifth row at the back, who can then contact his lawyers who are sitting, his barristers who are arguing for him at the front. And it's amazing, this Pinochet connection keeps coming back, in that the treatment afforded to Pinochet was significantly less harsh than that Julian is going through, even as a remand prisoner, where he is not considered guilty of any crime yet. And for a peaceful man to be put in that way behind the dock as though he were a criminal when the war criminals are roaming free seems particularly upsetting. And also, that the person who defended Pinochet, Claire Montgomery, is also, I believe, the person who is part of the team that is prosecuting or persecuting Julian Assange on behalf of the United States. So this is an interesting twist to where the Pinochet connection keeps coming back to haunt us. Moving on from your what you surmise as a result of all these unusual coincidences around where David Morales stayed, whom he was in contact with, and quite a lot of evidence which you have posted, which helps us to build a bigger picture. If we step forward a few months, or about a year now, I guess, tell us a little bit about what's going on in the case in Spain, and how, coming back to Zohar Lahav and what he's doing, if you could tell us a little bit more about that, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the point you made about Julian's treatment in the court. I revealed, I think, the first photo, the clearest photo of him in the previous round of hearings earlier this year before the pandemic, when citizens and his family and others were able to attend the court hearings, and it showed him in a glass box. He looked flushed of color, with a very grim expression on his face, and he was staring down at the floor, trapped in a glass box with his legal team and his partner, Stella Morris, attempting to communicate or make eye contact with him. It's a really disturbing photo. And if you look closely, you'll see that the glass box was far more restrictive than the one in which Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi war criminal, was confined during his trial in Jerusalem. In fact, Eichmann was easily able to communicate with his lawyers. What has Julian Assange done to merit this treatment, to be put in a box or a cage? It's not, but that cage is symbolic of the entire prosecution strategy, which is to put his character on trial, to put him on trial as an evildoer, someone who is akin to a terrorist or a mass killer, and to accuse him of getting US informants killed. There's no factual basis for that at all. So I haven't seen how he's being confined in this current round of hearings, which, reporters have to cover by Zoom. And I hear that, the technical problems are massive and have interrupted the proceedings constantly. The access to these hearings has been limited. Human rights groups have been excluded. Only a small group of reporters is even interested in covering it. The Guardian, notably, has been used by the prosecution. Bogus reports by the Guardian have been used by the prosecution to demonize Assange. And yet the Guardian has barely covered the case at all.
And that's really interesting. I'm aware that Reporters Without Borders, for example, and Amnesty are 40 of the organizations that were originally granted access to what is the Old Bailey's cloud video platform, and that access was revoked by the judge on the first day of the trial. There are, between the courts, which are Court 9, which is the overflow court, and Court 10, which is Court 9, which is the actual court, and Court 10, which is the overflow court, there are 66 seats in the public gallery. And in those 66 seats, the judge only allowed 2 members of the public. And these 2 members of the public included the spaces allowable for NGOs, which was particularly disturbing. 3 seats we were told were reserved by the judge for VIPs. And as of just the end of last week, that's after 3 weeks of trial, when those VIPs didn't turn up for even one day, those 3 seats have now been released back to the public. So, even if you had 1 in 3 seats because of social distancing being used for the public, you could have had 22 people in the court, in the public galleries, in addition to the number of journalists in the room and the lawyers, etc. These are fairly large courtrooms, and yet only 2 and now 5 people are being allowed, which makes a mockery of the principle of open justice. What's also interesting about this principle of open justice is that right now, many of the mainstream journalists seem to be arguing that they wish to have sight of Julian's personal medical records in the interests of open justice, whereas they don't seem to be having a problem with the lack of open justice in many of their colleagues and the NGOs not being able to cover a trial, almost like in a dictatorial, brutalist state. So these ideas of law, justice, and are being used in a very misleading way to undermine Julian at every step, whether he wins or loses. Even, for example, if you would see this UC Global case as a win for Julian Assange, it's still something that he has lost. So this case has been run in a very particular way. It's also very interesting which witnesses the judge is allowing or not allowing. For example, the US were allowed to put in a second superseding indictment very close to the start of this trial, and that included a whole slew of content that needed a proper response, yet the defense were not allowed an adjournment to go away and prepare for that, and neither were they allowed, for example, most recently, the judge has ruled that she will not allow 2 expert witnesses, who can rebut the testimony of those like Kronberg, who say that the ADX who imply that the ADX is something of a walk in the park for Julian, and therefore is not something that he should be worried about, and therefore offers, in effect, offers comparable circumstances to what he would, and care to what he would have in prison here, which, as you know, is not a particularly high standard in any case, given that even key incidents such as the discovery of a razor blade, which is of course used as a tool for self-harm or suicide, in his on his person, or rather in his cell, was not recorded appropriately in terms of the additional treatment that was given. So it was recorded as Craig Murray. And for all our viewers watching here, please follow the evidence and the absolutely fantastic analysis put together by Craig Murray at craigmurray.org, because he's pointed out the double standards being used, both in terms of the equality of arms, in terms of how the defense and the prosecution don't seem to have equal rights in court, and also the way in which Julian's being treated. Slight aside there in relation to the court, because we brought it up, but coming back to you, Max, could you tell us, in terms of final thoughts about where the case is going now and what you're working on at the moment?
Well, it's a show trial. What's taking place in London is a show trial, as you just illustrated. And it reminds me distinctly of the post 9/11 terror trials that Gordon Kronberg, the US attorney who would prosecute Assange in Northern Virginia, presided over. And I've actually seen Kronberg in action, having been a witness to some of those proceedings of terror suspects who were guilty of really nothing and who have been exonerated. And I've seen Kronberg belt out anti-Muslim, just straight up racist rhetoric in court. He appears to be a fanatical ideologue, authoritarian personality. And so what's taking place in London is distinctly post 9/11 and uniquely American, I would say. It really reminds me of just our whole experience here during the so-called war on terror.
I think you're right. I think the interesting thing also is that the UK prosecution on behalf of the US is relying heavily on Kronberg's affidavit and the affidavit of his colleague, but neither of them will be cross-questioned. They have been exempt from the court's questioning. What's also interesting in terms of some of the technical difficulties that have been experienced in court is that Khalid El-Masri's testimony had to be read out because he couldn't connect to the cloud video platform. And this was quite unusual in that for me, it seemed quite unusual as a lay witness, because other witnesses who had problems with the cloud video platform, we just moved them to another day. But El-Masri's testimony, firstly, the US insisted that they would not admit there had been any torture at Guantanamo or that El-Masri had been tortured. This is a German citizen who was on a holiday trip in Macedonia, who was abducted, rendited, tortured, sodomized. And when they realized that it was a case of mistaken identity, they continued to torture him brutally for months before finally releasing him in Albania to wander around. He thought he was going to be shot in the back of the head. Albanian police then picked him up as suddenly this man roaming in the middle of nowhere, sent him back to Germany. Nobody believed him. And he lost his wife and family who had moved back to Lebanon, I believe. And then what happened was that the State Department cables came out. And a lot of people keep asking, why is it that Julian didn't redact any more things? And one of the things we have to recognize is that these kinds of complex pictures can only be made when people who have been subject to the treatment, subject to the persecution, have an option to look at the material and say how it relates to them, and who are able to use, who don't have to rely on the Guardians and the New York Times and the Washington Posts of this world to censor what information you see. So, for example, what is important in Algeria, what is important in another part of the world, may not necessarily be important in Britain or America. So you're absolutely right. It is very interesting that the way in which it is being run, which certainly feels to an outsider who doesn't usually visit court, very much like a show trial. Over to you, Max. You were about to say something.
Well, it's a show trial, and at the same time, it is the trial of the century, or the trial of our generation on freedom of the press. And while so much of the press is restricted, we don't hear from the Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post much protest about that, about access being restricted. And as I reported, the Washington Post's top national security reporter, Ellen Nakashima, was spied on by UC Global. They attempted to steal her voice recorder. I showed the notes of the spy who attempted to do that in my report. The Washington Post and Ellen Nakashima in protest have not even covered the UC Global spying case in Madrid. And in fact, the Washington Post has just announced new guidelines, with Nakashima herself tweeting them out, on how they will look upon what they call hack and leak operations with deep suspicion, and seek to investigate the interests of those who are leaking documents that are hacked to the Washington Post. It's so ridiculous, because what they do is further cast suspicion on WikiLeaks as a vehicle for Russian disinformation. They're trying to imply that WikiLeaks has published false information when it has never published one false word. And they are hypocrites, because what the Washington Post does day in and day out is publish the tall tales of unnamed US officials, CIA assessments, NSA high confidence, under the guise of actual journalism. So they're the ultimate sort of channel for the US intelligence agencies. And I think that helps explain the reluctance of so much of the mainstream press to cover this hearing, or even get really outraged about it. I think if the mainstream press, if the Fleet Street publications, along with the Washington Post and New York Times, were outraged, and their op-ed boards were thundering condemnation of Assange's prosecution outcome and the outcome of this extradition hearing dramatically, but instead the New York Times and Washington Post cheered as Julian Assange was arrested in editorials issued by their op-ed board. Now, so I mean, that's kind of that kind of relates to the Spanish case, in that what's come out, what has emerged from the Spanish case, I think invalidates the extradition of Julian Assange. It invalidates his prosecution, and there's precedent for it. The prosecution of Daniel Ellsberg for revealing the Pentagon Papers ended because Nixon was exposed. Richard Nixon was exposed for seeking to burglarize the office of the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg in order to demonize him as a madman. And the violations of privacy that have occurred under the watch of Mike Pompeo's CIA and probably the current of Julian Assange and all his associates is far worse than what took place in the Nixon administration. Beyond that, and I mean specifically the violation of attorney-client privilege. You can't have a fair trial if the prosecution is snooping on the defense. And that's exactly what happened here. I mean, we've clearly established the DOJ clearly has had access to the surveillance tapes of those meetings in the embassy was having with his attorneys. It should just all be thrown out the window for that reason. Then I've reported that 2 weeks after David Morales, the CIA contractor spying on Assange, proposed robbing the offices of Assange's legal team, WikiLeaks legal team, 2 weeks after, the Madrid office of Baltasar Garzón, who is lead counsel for Julian Assange, was robbed. This is reported in El País by hooded men who rustled through papers but took nothing. Very unusual. This is another event that should invalidate the extradition. And then you have the meeting with Dana Rohrabacher, which was brought up in Jennifer Robinson's testimony in the London trial, where a congressman who was an ally of Trump goes to meet with Assange, offers official pardon in exchange for him helping Trump with the Robert Mueller investigation at a time when Trump and his people thought he was going to be indicted for collusion, by proving that the source of the Democratic National Committee email hack or leak or emails was not Russian intelligence and was likely someone like Seth Rich at DNC Insider. And of course, Julian Assange refused that because he and WikiLeaks have never burned a source. He may not have even known who the source was because of the secure server that WikiLeaks uses to obtain documents from whistleblowers. And so Rohrabacher, to the extent that he was speaking on behalf of Donald Trump, was offering a quid pro quo win-win arrangement with Julian Assange. Julian Assange refuses to engage in it, and then that administration hands down 17 counts, 17 indictments under the Espionage Act. That should also invalidate his extradition to the US. And then finally, the assassination plot proposed by David Morales, the stalking of Stella Morris, the stalking of Rafael Correa, who was the former president of Ecuador, all the psychological warfare games played in the embassy indicate clearly that if he is extradited to the US, he will be tortured. He will be treated, he will be in the hands of the very intelligence agency and government that devised that campaign of black operations against him and his associates.
Yes,
all these points have to be considered in the case in London, and that's why it's so important for the press to cover the case in Madrid.
Yeah, and it's also very interesting how the testimony from Cassandra Fairbanks about Grinnell and his involvement in all of this, and I'll ask you to comment on that if I may later, if you'd like to. I'd also try to point to Herman and Chomsky's model. I'm an academic, so I sometimes think in terms of model, and they talk about how, when you were talking about how the journalists were affected by, seem to have been affected, not were affected, seem to have been affected by the fact that they source a lot of their information. And in Herman and Chomsky's model, they talk about the 5 filters, which include ownership, advertising, but also sourcing, and the flack and fear that arises in relation to how the media determines how news is presented, and how WikiLeaks, in the way in which it shared information in a relatively unfiltered but yet thoughtful and responsible way, was trying to create a technological solution to the problems that many of us in the general public are finding, with the media filtering out a lot of the information that is actually relevant to us to make informed decisions. And alongside that information, you also need power. And I think that's what a lot of the organizing and the solidarity around Julian is showing. And I'd like to acknowledge first the protesters from the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, who are standing outside the Old Bailey every day in wind, rain and shine, protesting against this show trial, because their presence is hugely important, and they're insisting that citizens get a right to challenge the system as it currently stands. And I'd also like to acknowledge the work of people like yourself, people in the UK, with people at Declassified UK, Matt Curtis and Mark Curtis and Matt Kennard, who've done some very interesting work in relation to the conflicts of interest, in relation to the chief magistrate, in relation the issues in relation to the case, and where there are concerns about the judicial oversight in this case, which are very real and very, very worrying. So, Max, any final thoughts around any of the points we've raised today before we close? We're almost at the hour.
Well, there's a lot to say, and you're right that Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis have done really important work. In fact, they're the only reporters that I know of in the UK who probed the previous judge's conflicts of interest, which were substantial. And that just goes to show how sometimes the worst or most pernicious forms of propaganda are those that omit the most obvious cases of corruption. And that's what the whole British press has done. And I should also acknowledge Action for Assange. A group of American citizens came to DC to hold vigils across the city at significant locations to protest Julian Assange's extradition. And I think, lay the groundwork for a full-time protest movement if he is brought here for what will be a continuation of this show trial in a courtroom where the jury will be pulled from the ranks of the intelligence community and, Department of Homeland Security and all these other agencies that exist in that district. So that it's important to acknowledge everyone right now who is coming together when the rest of the country and the whole political class seems to either be demonizing Assange or tuning out what's taking place in the most important trial of the most important legal proceeding relating to a free press, probably of our lifetime. So going forward, the Spanish judge has made several significant requests. I just reported on one. He's seeking the testimony of Zohar Lahav, the Vice President of Executive Protection for Sheldon Adelson's Las Vegas Sands. And he is suggested in documents that I obtained that he wants to probe Lahav's connections to US intelligence. It was Lahav who recruited David Morales of UC Global. It was Lahav who was constantly in contact with him and seemed to have been the real liaison between UC Global and US intelligence. And the Spanish judge mentioned the name of Brian Nagel, who I mentioned, who is the former cybercrime specialist for the US Secret Service, who went on to be the director of global security for Sheldon Adelson. An interview like this would be explosive. I mean, it would likely blow open the links to US intelligence or the cover-up of it, as well as the links to the Trump organization and Trump's inner circle. And therefore, the US Department of Justice, in an email I obtained, is stonewalling. They do not want to allow this testimony, this interview to take place. And so obviously they want to cover up their own role in this campaign of black operations against Julian Assange, his associates, and even members of the mainstream US press. And I mean, that's it's also somewhat unprecedented for the US to obstruct cooperation with the Spanish trial in the national court, given the legal agreement signed in 2004 for reciprocity between Spain and the US. And so I think we need more pressure, more attention on this case in Spain. And I'll also be reporting on what you mentioned relating to Cassandra Fairbanks' testimony about Richard Grenell and Arthur Schwartz, another Trump crony, knowing about the arrest of Julian Assange like a year in advance and having detailed information of what was taking place inside the embassy. How did they know that? And, what are their connections to, we know Richard Grenell was like the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, and then he was in the ambassador in Germany, but Arthur Schwartz, this is the former communications director to Sheldon Adelson. How did these guys have such privileged information? It's all, part of the same saga, and I'll be reporting more on it because, as I said before, it absolutely invalidates the legitimacy of the case for Assange's extradition and prosecution in the United States.
Thanks, Max. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for sparing an hour of your time to talk to us. I'd like to acknowledge, we've talked a lot about journalism being weak, but I'd like to acknowledge people like Craig, people like Stefania Marisi, people like Daniel Risa, people like Serena Tinari, a number of good journalists, Mohamed El Mazi, Kevin Gotzola, alternative journalists who are willing to re-examine and look at the truth and to tell us what's really going on. And of course, those like Mark and Matt and yourself, and the great John Pilger, who've all done fantastic work, and Jonathan Cook more recently writing that fantastic article about why the mainstream media won't cover the case and won't even look at some of the detail. So a huge salute to them, huge salute to the supporters, and thank you very much again for sparing the time. Good night.
Thanks a lot, Deepa.